I'm going to mute myself.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to this evening's PILC panel about the legal implications and environmental impacts of honeybees on public lands. My name is Claire Money, and I'm a 1L representative for the Public Interest Environmental Law Conference, and I will be moderating this panel tonight. Thanks so much to our panelists for presenting and to everyone here attending. Before we get started, I just wanted to give a couple of announcements. Our Alumni Association, Friends of Land, Air, Water, operates an annual public interest environmental law summer stipend program, which awards stipends to law students who work in public interest environmental law positions. If you would like to make a donation to this program, you may do so through either PayPal or Network for Good, and a document will be shared in the YouTube chat by a PILC representative with more information and links to donate. Additionally, in that document, you will find information about registering to receive CLE credit from this conference. A number of panels that we have on our schedule are CLE accredited, so any legal professionals looking to get CLE credits should look into that as well. Additionally, throughout the presentation, please feel free to ask any questions in the YouTube chat. Our panelists have saved some time at the end of the presentation for a Q&A session, so if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to ask them and we'll save them all for the end. Now I will just give a brief introduction to all the panelists you'll be hearing from tonight. Mary O'Brien is the director of a new nonprofit, Project 1100, the major purpose of which is to end and prevent permitting of honeybee apiaries on public lands on the Colorado Plateau. Her doctorate in botany at Rancho Santa Ana Botanic Garden focuses on pollination biology. Scott Black is the executive director of Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, the world's largest nonprofit that works exclusively to protect invertebrates. Now retired, Wayne Padgett was a vegetation ecologist with the U.S. Forest Service for 25 years and with the Bureau of Land Management for 5 years. He is currently a member of the board of directors for the Utah Native Plant Society. He has focused on the protection and proper management of the most vulnerable ecosystems and species on public lands. Tara Cornelisi is the senior scientist in the Endangered Species Program at the Center for Biological Diversity, where she spearheads the Saving the Insects campaign. She has a PhD in environmental studies from the University of California, Santa Cruz. I will now hand it over to Mary to get started.
Thanks, Claire. Let's see, share screen and let's see. There, oops. Is that showing? And can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Great. So I'm just going to briefly lay out the purpose of this particular panel, which is the legal implications and environmental impacts of honeybee apiaries on public lands. And I think Scott will be explaining the 3,600 bees. And just to set the context for it, an apiary is a collection of hives. And in the case of honeybees, there can be about 10,000 to 60,000 honeybees in one hive, and then a permit on public lands will often be 50 to 100 hives in one apiary, with the permit having a dozen to 50 other sites with hives. And one thing to note is that native bees, except bumblebees, do not live in hives and are solitary. Even bumblebees, which are a social bee, live in nests that are much, much smaller, probably the larger end of it being 500 in a nest versus 60,000. So the order of this presentation, and thank you all for being here. Yeah, Scott's going to go first, talking about how honeybees, particularly in the numbers that occur in apiaries, impact native bees. Wayne is going to talk about how honeybee impacts native plants. How does that happen? Tara is going to be talking about the Endangered Species Act and how that relates to honeybees and native bees. And last of all, I'm going to be talking about some of the efforts actually all 4 of our organizations that are represented on this panel are doing to end the permitting of apiaries on public lands. So I'm going to go hand this over to Scott.
All right. There we go. Can everybody see that and hear me okay?
Yeah, it's not on full presentation.
Let's put it on slideshow. Hold on. There we go.
There we
All
go.
right. Well, thanks for that, Mary. Thanks for laying some context. I'm going to talk about the potential impacts of honeybees to native bees, pollinators, and wild ecosystems. Or did mention the Xerces Society. We use applied research and community science to drive our outreach, technical assistance to land managers, our restoration and advocacy efforts for a broad variety of invertebrates, not just pollinators, everything from freshwater mussels to bumblebees and monarch butterflies to snails. So I think all of you likely really know that pollinators are important. More than 85% of flowering plants require an animal, mostly an insect, to move pollen. And pollinators really do provide an ecosystem service to us as well. So I'll talk a bit about wild systems in a second, but 35% of crop production worldwide, it comes from a pollinator, and this is worth a lot of money. And this is some of our best food, our tastiest food, our most nutritious food comes from insect pollination. Now, there are a variety of insect pollinators, or a variety of pollinators, actually. In Madagascar, lemurs pollinate. There's a slug that pollinates. Bats pollinate. Hummingbirds pollinate, and other birds. But the vast majority of pollination comes from these groups of insects. Wasps do pollinate. Butterflies and moths certainly pollinate. Beetles and flies are incredibly important pollinators in certain systems. But when we think about pollinators and we think about really what is driving these systems, it's bees. And bees drive these systems and are so important for pollination for a few reasons. One, most animals eat pollen or sip nectar. Bees actually collect and transport pollen. They're one of the only animals that are collecting it and moving it. They're moving it to their nest in this case. They forage in and around a nest, so they're going out into these same areas, and they exhibit flower constancy, which means if they find a good resource, they're sticking with that resource. Makes them great pollinators, and they move a lot of pollen. But when most people think about bees, they think about European honeybees. And I say European honeybees because a lot of people don't even know that honeybees were introduced from Europe, introduced in the 1700s. And for the first several hundred years, they were just here producing honey. But they became a major crop pollinator with the advent of large monocultures and the widespread use of broad spectrum pesticides in the 1930s through 1950s. As Mary mentioned, they have large social colonies where most bees are single moms provisioning a nest. These bees are capable of really using more resources because of their large colonies. And their distribution is largely managed by beekeepers who move them around. And I do want to point out that beekeeping is not conservation. It really is animal husbandry. It's important animal husbandry, especially for agriculture, but it is animal husbandry, not conservation. Now, honeybees are really vital for our large agricultural systems. The way we grow our food is now dependent on honeybees. And beekeepers are seeing large losses every year, often up to 40%. Hard to be a beekeeper these days. But I do want to point out that honeybees are not at risk of extinction. There are actually more honeybees on the planet now than there ever were in the past because we manage these animals. And it's vital to help beekeepers, but we should not imperil our native bees in our wildlands to help honeybees. We just really shouldn't. We should not pit these two animals against each other because it's not going to work for either of them. Now, North America, as Mary mentioned, is home to approximately 3,600 species of native bees, and they come in every shape and size. Most people they see this and they think of a bee, right? This is a bumblebee, our endangered rusty patch bumblebee from the Midwest and Northeast. But most people would not look at this and say, oh, that's a bee, right? This is a cuckoo bee, that's a dime, that's the 1999 on there, and it's about maybe twice that size. They're tiny. They come in every color, every shape, and they're just amazingly cool animals. I mean, they're really, really neat. And they've radiated out, and they're in pretty much every terrestrial ecosystem throughout North America. And they are vital for pollination of our native plants. The bulk of the pollination of our native plants on our Forest Service, BLM, state lands, any wild lands really comes from native bees, as well as butterflies, flies, beetles, and other pollinators as well. But native bees are really driving these systems. And why is that important? Well, the fruits and seeds of our wildlands, of the plants that grow in our wildlands, are the major part of the diet of all sorts of animals, game birds, songbirds, even grizzly bears. Grizzly bears often eat berries as part of their bulking up to get ready for winter, and berries are pollinated by our native insects. They're also really as important as food. Butterflies and moths, and even bee larvae, are food for numerous animals. Actually, studies have shown that caterpillars are a vital food source for many, many of our birds. So if we're harming our native pollinators, we're not just harming them, we're harming other animals up and down the food chain. And pollinators are in trouble. Over 40% of invertebrate pollinator species may be facing extinction, particularly bees and butterflies, in the coming decades. And I do want to point out that it's not honeybees that are driving, bees to extinction across every ecosystem, right? We've got climate change, we've got habitat loss, we've got rampant overuse of insecticides as well as other pesticides. Many, many issues, as Dave Wagner said, death by 1,000 cuts, right? But if you are in a wildland and that is your home and there are large numbers of honeybees, it can be a problem. And I will show you a little more of that. So the main impact from native bees from honeybees is competition for resources and disease. And I'll go through each of those separately. So competition can have direct and indirect effects and can be broken down into I break it down into these this linear way. First, there's resource depletion. Honeybees can deplete the available pollen and nectar that our native animals need. There's resource shift. Honeybees can directly and indirectly, through that resource depletion, force native bees to less rewarding and less abundant sources. And if there's enough honeybees, you can have competitive exclusion, where honeybees can force native bees actually out of the area. And this all leads to decreased efficiency. Sounds very sciencey, but what this means is that these above factors can lead to decreased fecundity. That's having fewer young, which of course, what does that do? It leads to declining populations and potentially endangerment. And it's amazing how much resources honeybees use. A single hive can use 20 to 130 pounds of pollen a year, can collect that. 120 to 900 pounds of nectar a year. So when Mary mentioned the number of hives that might be out there in an apiary, Kane and Tepedino looked at a 40 hive apiary, which is pretty common. And they found that it was a pollen equivalent of about 4 million native bees. 4 million native bees. They're using that much resource. And what this does is it really leads to honeybee densities affect native bee abundance, and they affect native bee foraging success. And the more data we get on this, basically the more we know that this seems to be happening in our wild systems. We also have disease. So we've got this competition for resources that can lead to problems with our native bees. But native bees actually have been shown to spread diseases. Sorry, take that back. Actually, they do spread diseases to each other, but honeybees have been shown to spread diseases to native bees when interacting at a shared resource. And disease is a leading cause of decline of both native and managed bees. And I'll show you, they do go back and forth, so I didn't really misspeak there. So disease transmission can happen in a couple ways. We've got spillover. Managed bees visit resources that native bees are using and infect native bees. We've got facilitation. This is stress induced and goes back and forth, native bees to managed bees and back and forth. And then we've got spillback. Native bees can give diseases to managed bees, and then managed bees can amplify that and spread more disease back to native bees. So this is a major issue in potential decline. And I really liked Greystock in that it's one of these, I just like when science just spells it out. One of the best ways to avoid the potentially devastating effects of spillover, spillback, and facilitation in wild bees is to prevent their mixing with managed bees. It's just as simple as that. And so in conclusion, pollinators are in decline. Native bees are facing extinction threats, while non-native honeybees really are not. Honeybees compete with native bees for limited resources, especially at sensitive times of the year in sensitive habitats, and this can reduce fecundity in native bee populations. Managed bees spread diseases to native bees. Diseases is a leading cause of native bee declines, and managed bees have been shown to amplify this problem. And that will lead to problems with plants that Wayne's going to talk about next. So in sum, I think it's vital that we should not pit honeybees against native bees. Native bees need these wildlands to sustain healthy populations. They have nowhere else to go. But I do want to say that our ag right now, as maybe we change the way we do ag, but right now we're built on beekeepers, a lot of our large ag. And we should do a better job of providing for honeybees in that agricultural matrix. We should provide for honeybees where they're used. Farmers, farm agencies should be doing a better job. And maximizing acreage in the next farm bill for conservation reserve program would be a really good step, but we need to do a better job of just keeping honeybees healthy and safe where they are used. With that, I'm going to go to Wayne. You're on mute, Wayne.
Okay, how's that?
You probably want to put it on, there we go. Perfect.
I was just, okay, sorry, people. I'm going to talk about kind of the relationship between non-native bees, native bees, and pollinators, and then kind of the relationship. But I'm going to really focus particularly on the rare plant species, because that's where have our greatest concern. We're concerned with all of it, but that's a big concern. So what's the fuss? What are the relationships between native and especially rare plants and pollinators? What's the scope of the issues related to bee production, introductions on native and native plants on public lands? That's really our topic today. So honeybees are being introduced on public lands at a tremendous level. And of course, native plants evolved over millennia with native bees. As was said, the bulk of the pollination of native plants is with native bees. And honeybees will pollinate some, but not all plants as effectively as native bees. And in fact, they can't even pollinate some of the plants that we have out there. And of course, we all know the importance of native plants in their role they play in maintaining our ecosystems, from animals, from large animals to small animals, birds, and everything. Depends on the plants. Without the plants, there is no animals. There are no animals. So the scope of the problem that I'm going to talk about right now is that here's an issue. In Utah alone, there are 296 rare plants. I mean, that's a lot, almost 300 rare plants in Utah alone. And of those 296 plants species, almost 252 occur on lands managed by the BLM and the Forest Service. So there's a relationship. And of these 296 rare plant species in Utah, 52 are classified by NatureServe as imperiled, and 112 are classified as critically imperiled. So what does that mean? Well, imperiled plants are species. This imperiled relates to plants, animals, all of those. But imperiled means that the high risk of extinction or elimination due to restricted range, few populations or occurrences, steep decline, severe threats, or other factors. But critically imperiled is a very high risk of extinction or elimination. These are the species that are on the brink. Very restricted range, very few populations or occurrences, very steep declines, or very severe threats. In some cases, we have plants that are in the way of bulldozers. They're waiting to put a road or whatever through the middle of their population. So that's kind of what we're talking about. And so of those 296 rare plant species, over a third are either imperiled or critically imperiled. So what do we know about native plant pollinator relationships? Well, we do know that pollinators are needed for the reproduction of 90% of flowering plants, period. But presently, native bees pollinate about 75% of North American flowering plant species. That's native and non-native. But native bees play a critical role. And pollen is often a limiting resource to native bees even before the introduction of honeybees. Research related to pollinators and plants has been conducted for years, but most of this research has been on crops and other species that are of economic value. So there's very little that's been done regarding native plants and their relationship to native bees. And Vince Stepanino, who is a retired bee, I call him a bee god, but he's the bee specialist retired from Utah State University, has described that generally native bee species are more effective pollinators on native flora, which have evolved, as I mentioned earlier, evolved with the native bees rather than the honeybees. And many native bee species are extremely specialized in the flower species they visit for pollen, but not nectar. As was pointed out earlier, there's both pollen and nectar being collected from these plants, and native bees really focus primarily on the pollen. They do the nectar as well. But some plant species have special pollinator requirements that honeybees can't even provide. For example, long-nosed bees are capable of pollinating tubular flowers like this penstemon here. Honeybees are not long-nosed and are not capable of doing this. So there are a lot of species that are incapable, they can't be pollinated by honeybees. Certain flowers are adapted for buzz pollination. And buzz pollination is where the bees rapidly contract their flight muscles, and in producing strong vibrations which release the pollen from the anthers in the flowers, just thus making it available for the transfer of pollen from one plant to another. Again, bumblebees and some other native bees can do this, but honeybees can't. So there's a relationship. There are definitely some species that need the buzz pollination and others don't. So what do we know about rare plant pollinator relationships? Well, the Center for Plant Conservation, one of the organizations focused on science-based protection of rare plant species, is the Center for Plant Conservation. And they've developed this website of data of research, of research articles focused on the pollinators of rare plant species. And so this database is available. And so I queried all 296 of those plant species that occur in Utah to find out how many species we have information for. And what I found is that we know something about only 23 of those 252 plant species. Well, that's the 252 plant species that are managed by the U.S. Forest Service and the BLM. But this is like the pollinator groups. This is the bees, the wasps, the moths, the butterflies, the birds, the bats, etc. So that we know something about those 23 plants that are up there and their relationship to the pollinator group. We know something more about just 20 of those species, about what family those pollinators belong to. The bumblebee is in the Apiaries family, and some of the sweat bees, well, the sweat bees are in the Halictidae, I don't know how to say it, Halictidae family. So we know a bit more that we at least know what the family is of some of the species that pollinate these 20 plants up here. But we only know details like genus and species of the pollinators that are associated with 11 plant species out of that 296. So that's less than 5% of the total we know very little about. So that's kind of the status of where we are with research. And this database is pretty complete. So I found a few other articles that weren't in there, but it's a pretty complete database. So basically there's not much information. So what's happening on public lands? Well, in 2020, 946 honeybee hives were permitted on 5 national forests in Utah and Arizona. And in 2020, a 96 hive apiary was permitted on the Logan district of the Uinta-Wasatch Cache National Forest, which is here in northern Utah. So this apiary was on the Logan district, and the Logan district has 13 endemic plants. Endemic plants are those that are restricted in their distribution. In other words, like they may occur, well, one of the species occurs only in Logan Canyon, and one of the other species only occurs on the slopes above Tony Grove Lake. Other species are endemic to maybe 1 or 2 counties in northern Utah or southern Idaho. Basically, they're restricted in their distribution severely. And 7 of those species that are of these 13 that are within 9 kilometers of the apiary are imperiled. So they're not critically imperiled, but they're imperiled. And that's an important thing to know. So it's been estimated that a typical 96 hive apiary, which we have here in Logan Canyon, would remove enough pollen in 3 to 4 month period to rear 9 to 12 million native bees. And when we know that a lot of our species are dependent on native bees to pollinate them, that's a critical amount. And now there currently is a request to pasture about 9,000 more honeybee hives on 4 national forests in Utah. And this was Vince Teppanino that reported on this in the Seagull Lily, which is a newsletter for the Utah Native Plant Society. So what do we know about the relationships among rare plants and native bees? As I mentioned, not a lot, but we know we have general understanding of what's going on. We do know general things about bees and native plants, and so native rare plants. Native rare plant species, of course, as I mentioned earlier, have evolved over millennia with our native pollinators. And I think, as was mentioned earlier, native bees are 2 to 3 times more effective at pollination than honeybees. Honeybees are more interested in the honeybees are more interested in the nectar than the pollen. Native bees are mostly pollen collectors. So which is necessary in pollinating and spreading the genetic material. Honeybees consume what limited floral resources are available, which results in a loss of native bee loss of native bees and which means a loss of pollination efficiency. I'm sorry. So there's potential for significant harm to imperil bee species, as was mentioned earlier. And because of that, there's potential significant harm to those plants that rely on those specialized pollinator species, and subsequent harm to the entire ecosystems where those apiaries are being placed. So we know a lot about the relationship between honeybees to native bees. These are conclusions. We know, for example, the potential that for significant risk of native species, that there's significant risk to native species from the introduction. We don't know a lot about the specific pollinators of many of our rare plant species, but we do know that native bee species are more effective pollinators of the flora than the honeybees are. So where there's concern, the effects of honeybees on native bees and translates to negative impacts on native species, especially in rare plant species, native plant species. We know there's a potential for the impacts to native plant species, rare plant species that require special pollination. We know that there's a potential for subsequent impacts to the entire ecosystems where apiaries would be placed, these native plant communities. And we know that a categorical exclusion on all managed lands ignore the potential environmental effects of honeybees on native bees. And that's not acceptable. We know enough to know that honeybees do not have a place on public lands. So I'd like to acknowledge Mary O'Brien, Vince Teppanino, and Jim Kane, and Jennifer Oldham, who is an independent journalist who provided some information on the native bee populations that we were discussing in Logan Canyon. So we'll there's my contact information. We'll put this up later for people to contact me. So I'd like to pass it over now to Tara Cornelisi. I'm sorry. I knew I'd get it wrong.
Got in the end, stage
Okay.
fright, you know.
Let me stop here.
All right. Oh wait, okay. So, open. All right, can you guys, you good? Full screen?
Yep.
Excellent. All right, so thank you, Wayne. Great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of what Wayne was sort of ending on about how, you know, we shouldn't accept, you know, honeybees on public land, and ways that we can work towards that and find these solutions. And Mary will talk further about that, some more nitty gritty. But I wanted to talk about the intersection with the Endangered Species Act. So Scott mentioned, you know, the insects are declining, right? No doubt pollinators are in trouble. This is a figure from a paper that came out last year that I was a co-author on with some Xerces folks as well, about an international scientists formulate a roadmap for insect conservation. So you can kind of give a peruse through the wheel here, but it includes things that are really important for this discussion, such as phasing out pesticides, as well as education and awareness, which is why we're here, right? But one thing I wanted to focus on here is the conservation of threatened species. So that's a really important component of insect conservation, particularly with pollinators as we're talking. So that's kind of the intersection of where my work meets on this wheel. And then also this kind of other area here, prioritization, talks about assessments of conservation status of insect groups. And as Wayne was just mentioning, we don't know much. We need a lot more data, right? And so by doing petitions and petitioning for species and looking at these issues, we can also get more information and start to do more status assessments as well. So that's what I'm going to plug kind of for how the ESA is an important part of the bigger picture of insect conservation. So the Endangered Species Act, to give you guys a little bit of an overview very quick, it's one of the world's most strongest laws for protecting species threatened with extinction. When it was enacted, it was acknowledged that the economic growth and development was happening without adequate measures to protect our rich national heritage. And the Supreme Court found that the intent of Congress in enacting the ESA was to halt and reverse the trend towards species extinction, whatever the cost. So it's really strong in that language, and it's important to conserve pollinators, which is why we're talking about it for this issue of apiaries. It's implemented by the United States Fish and Wildlife Service for most of the critters we're talking about today, but the National Marine Fisheries Service also oversees marine animals. The protections require the establishment of critical habitat, as well as a recovery plan that outline the goals and the tasks and the cost that will be needed to actually improve the species on the list. And finally, it also prevents take, which is an important component of the Endangered Species Act in terms of preventing harm to listed species. And as Scott, give a comprehensive overview, there's clear potential harm of honeybee apiaries on some listed species, or hopefully listed species, on some rare pollinators. So trying to talk to you a little bit about the petition process. Basically, petitions require a lot of information. And so we have the rusty patch bumblebee listed on the continental United States, and that's it so far, right? And so we've got some other petitions in the works and the docket that Fish and Wildlife Service are looking at. But the reason we don't have that many is we just don't know a lot. So the part of that is that the petition requires a lot of information. It requires substantial scientific and commercial information to indicate that a species is threatened with extinction in a significant portion of its range, and particularly by 5 types of threats. And I'll give you a list of those in a second. But it has to kind of be very specific and prove that the threat is imminent and that it's a threat to that species and its habitat. So the threats that you need to address in the petitioning process are modification or curtailment of habitat or range, so habitat destruction, which is a fairly easy one. Overutilization, which is a little bit trickier, and it was a little bit more common when animals were collected or traded. Disease or predation, inadequacy of existing regulatory mechanisms, which basically means there's nothing else that's protecting the animal, and other factors. And you can kind of throw climate change and invasive species and those other factors as well. So I sort of put here a little animation of where honeybees would intersect with some of these threats. So, as kind of Scott went over the details and what Wayne just talked about how honeybees could modify habitat, especially in terms of the plants and the vegetation. We can see that. Overutilization, it's a little less clear. However, disease and predation, disease is particularly clear, how honeybees can transmit diseases, and vice versa, as we saw, right? Inadequacy of existing regulatory mechanisms is definitely an issue. And Mary's going to talk more about how even NEPA is not even really useful for this issue at this point, at least. And then other factors, of course, honeybees are non-native species, and so we can consider them, as non-native species. All right. Okay, so I'll give you a couple examples of some bees that are on public land that we have petitioned for at the Center for Biological Diversity that could be and are seeming to be affected by honeybees. So this is the Mojave Poppy Bee on the right-hand side. It is on the Las Vegas bear poppy, which I think I saw as at least one of the bear poppies in Wayne's list of plants that we know something about. So it's a specialist on bear poppies, and particularly this Las Vegas bear poppy. It's only known currently, at least that we know of, in about 7 locations, so those yellow triangles in the Lake Mead National Recreation Area. It's likely gone from the other areas in Clark County around Las Vegas, and we know those from some surveys. It seems to be almost definitely extinct from Utah now. There's been more recent surveys since we submitted the petition that haven't found the bee. And then it appears to be gone in California, but those were sort of more general surveys, and so definitely more info is needed there. Apiaries are especially concerned for the Mojave Poppy Bee because it is a specialist native pollinator, and you kind of heard already about why that could be. Particularly, this bee is really tiny. I think it's a little bit bigger than that one that Scott had next to the dime, but not much. And it doesn't travel far, so it can't go that far. So it kind of has to exploit the bear poppies that are right within its range. And if a honeybee's around and collects that pollen, well, then it's kind of out of luck in that case. Another thing that scientists found with this bee is that honeybees tend to get to the bear poppies really early in the morning. And so unfortunately, the honeybees will actually take some of the pollen provisions before the Mojave Poppy Bees even get there. So that's one example. Another, a couple bumblebees. So this is a Western bumblebee, which currently is up for consideration of listing under the Act. It was petitioned for in 2015, Defenders of Wildlife. It was once one of the most common bumblebees in the Western US. Now it's kind of rarely seen, at least especially kind of in the Oregon, California area. And another species is kind of this picture in the right-hand corner is unfortunately as a result of the Western decline, this species has declined. This is the Suckley's cuckoo bumblebee, and it has declined by more than 90%. And here's a map. You can see kind of in the yellow where it was, and now more in the red where it's been found just since 2002, so quite a while ago now. It's very rare. It's called a cuckoo bee. Some of you may be familiar with cuckoo bees or the cuckoo term in relation to birds, and that it actually is a parasitic cuckoo bumblebee, and it takes over the nest of the Western bumblebee, subdues the queen, lays its own eggs, and then has the workers take care of its own brood. It sounds pretty harsh, but it's actually a really important regulatory niche or role in the ecosystem. It can keep host populations diverse and healthy, including by reducing some disease virulence. So, honeybees have been shown to reduce bumblebee reproductive success. They have changes in foraging behavior and average body size. So we know, as it was always already alluded to, that honeybees can really impact bumblebees. Suckley's cuckoo bumblebee in particular has recently been found exclusively on public lands. So this issue of apiaries on public lands is quite an issue for these two bumblebees. More recent observation of Suckley's was found in the Klamath National Forest. In the Klamath right now, there's at least one active permit for 100 hive apiaries at 4 different locations. And so if we assume that on average, there's about 30,000 honeybees in each one of those, that's about 12 million honeybees. So that's a lot of honeybees in just one area of the Klamath National Forest. Okay, so here's where it gets a little bit technical, so bear with me here. One of the important components of the Endangered Species Act is Section 7, consultations. And what this means is that any federal agency, so the United States Forest Service or the Bureau of Land Management, which are the 2 agencies we're mostly talking about tonight in terms of allowing apiaries on public lands, they need to consult with Fish and Wildlife Service whenever they're going to do something that could potentially be in an area where a listed species is. So this is kind of a flow chart of how that works. Up on top, first they check and see if there's a species in the habitat. And if that's not the case, then they end the consultation. However, if a species is found, then they need to look at whether that species is going to be in jeopardy, or if it's just going to be adversely affected, or its critical habitat will be adversely affected. And if that's not going to, then they end the consultation. If it is going to be adversely affected, then they need to incorporate some conservation measures, and they also need to do a formal consultation, which is a little bit more deep dive into the science and the impacts to the species. If they don't find that, then they kind of go back and forth, usually have some kind of mitigation measures, and don't have to actually do that formal consultation. This is important for the apiaries as a threat, which I'll get to in a minute, but I just wanted to make a point that in the formal consultation, so kind of that left-hand side box on the lower left-hand side, it looks at whether jeopardy has happened. And when a species is jeopardized, basically it jeopardizes its ability to survive into the future. And so we could think about that would actually potentially be, right, an issue with apiaries depending on the range of the listed species or the rarity or the other threats to the listed species. Unfortunately, there's just like a little bit of a, here I gotta move this window, there we go. There's a little bit of an issue and that authors looked at this consultation process in 2015, and they found that of 88,000 projects, between 2008 and 2015, there was only a jeopardy determination in 7% of those. So it's not a very common determination, and actually none of the projects were stopped or significantly altered. So this is something that we at the center really try to watchdog with the Fish and Wildlife Service to make sure we can get as many mitigations, as many conservation efforts for listed species as possible. Okay, so what does this mean with the apiaries? So let's pretend that this is basically going to go through the process that someone wants to put apiaries on public land. Someone wants to put apiaries on the US Forest Service land, for instance. So if a listed species is not there, then it's going to end the consultation, and the ESA is not really going to come into effect in this. And it's going to kind of just go through the typical NEPA process that Mary's going to outline in her talk next, and they will likely be permitted at this point in time. However, if they find that there are listed species in this area, particularly if it's a rare plant or a rare insect, there's a good chance that putting apiaries on the land will actually impact those species. So apiaries should come out in this analysis as a threat. However, it's up to the agencies to determine. Like I said, we can help. Basically, we push them along to make sure they have the best available science, and they actually do, really look at the impact of the apiaries. We've got such great information about the impacts of honeybees now that, Scott and Wayne went over already, that we can really point to that as extreme concern. So then if they do find that the species is going to be affected, if it's not going to be adversely affected, if it's not going to jeopardize the species, at least at this point, it's likely that apiaries would be permitted. We would definitely be looking for some extreme conservation mitigation measures in that case. It's hard to figure out what those are, considering we know the impacts. If jeopardy is found, then apiaries should not be permitted, at least according to the law. So this is a way that the Endangered Species Act gives us the legal ability to challenge some of these determinations to protect listed species from apiaries. Okay, so one more slide here. I just wanted to point out sort of a parallel longer-term solution. I think some of the other presentations started getting at this a little bit, but like Scott was saying, it's kind of a different thing. We've got agricultural honeybees, and then we've got our native bees on public lands. And the common enemy seems to be kind of pesticides, particularly neonicotinoids that remain in land and farmland long after they're used. And if you ask a beekeeper, why they need to put their apiaries on public land, oftentimes they'll say it's because the land that they usually do is just poisoned. It's full of pesticides. So one way we can try to combat this issue, another and kind of a parallel form, is to try to ban neonicotinoids. So the Saving America's Pollinators Act does just that. We introduced it in 2019, or Representative Blumenauer introduced it in 2019, not us. But we sort of, have been consultants on this. And then in 2020, for very obvious reasons, it was sort of ignored, but it's coming back this year. And so hopefully, you know, it's strong. It bans neonicotinoids. It also sets up a body to review pesticides in terms of their toxicity to bees. And then finally, it requires monitoring of native bees, which will help with some of that data issue that we have. So it's kind of another policy impact there. All right, so I think that is all I have. So I just wanted to thank Pilk and Mary O'Brien for organizing this, and I will hand it over to her.
Oh, thanks, Tara. Let me pull this up. How's that do? Can people see that?
No, not yet.
Really? Oh, let's see. I know what I may have forgotten to do was share my screen. And now I've lost, let's see. My bad. Does that show?
No, not yet.
Okay, I've got a problem and I apologize. And it all came about because I refused to share my screen. Let me try this and go back. No. I'm going to get this. I'm going to share my screen and I think that will show, right?
Yep.
Oh, good. And from beginning. All right. Is that showing?
Yep, you're good.
Great. So I'm going to talk about what actually all four of us, Utah Native Plant Society, Center for Biological Diversity, Xerces Society, Grand Canyon Trust has when I was there, was working on that, and Project 1100 are all working to end this permitting. Tara has mentioned one of the means of doing that. One of the focuses that the four of us have is this ending of permits being issued on federal lands via categorical exclusions from NEPA. And that means if they permit via categorical exclusion to a given beekeeper, they don't have to tell the public they're doing that. And they don't have to do any analysis of the potential impacts, because the idea of a categorical exclusion is that it is something that can be used for activities that will have no significant effect. So for 42 years under NEPA, categorical exclusion was defined as actions which do not individually or cumulatively have a significant effect on the human environment. In other words, the idea that if you wanted to permit an apiary, you would have to say it could not have a significant effect. Now, during the Trump administration last year, NEPA was radically changed, and the definition now is not that the actions do not have a significant effect. It would be that the agency has determined it doesn't have a significant effect normally. And you notice cumulatively, has disappeared, so that a bee species that's potentially affected by cattle grazing, removing the flowers in the area, plus honeybees, plus climate change, so drought, you don't think of all three of those. Now, those changes that were made to NEPA under the Trump administration are being litigated by certain conservation organizations, and they're under review now by the Biden administration, and likely this more vague meaning will be reverted back to cumulative impacts and actions which do not have a significant effect, not just that the agency claims they don't. So why did CEQ, Council on Environmental Quality, approve categorical exclusions for permitting of apiaries? In other words, at one time, BLM and separately Forest Service came to CEQ and said, we're going to allow permitting of honeybee hives, and we're going to call it having no significant impact. So why did CEQ approve that? They approved it because it was in the early 1980s, when there was much less information about the impacts of apiaries, honeybees on native bees. When it came to the agency, and I had asked Dinah Baer, the senior counsel, senior attorney there in CEQ at the time, why she approved these categorical exclusions. She said there was no objections when the Forest Service or BLM requested that apiary permitting be a CE category. And this is another note of how important organizations, conservation organizations are, because they heard no objections from anyone. And at the time, to Dinah Baer, who was approving it, it seemed a benign activity. Now, this picture is one she has taken of some male bees that are in a communal sleeping roost outside her house. She's now fascinated by native bees, has learned completely differently, and is embarrassed that that was approved back in the 80s. So the four of our organizations have put in a petition under the Administrative Procedure Act, which gives interested persons the right to petition for amendment of a rule. And this is what we are asking for in our petitions. So one petition went to the US Department of Agriculture and Forest Service, and we asked for three things. And this was in July of 2020, so just a few months ago. We asked to amend this particular regulation that the Forest Service has down in the list of categories for which categorical exclusions can be listed, can be used. And we're asking to take that out. The approving just that phrase, approving the use of National Forest Service land for apiaries. We're also asking to end the permitting of apiaries pursuant to this regulation, which the regional forester in Intermountain region told the national forests in Utah, Nevada, and Western Wyoming and Idaho, Southern Idaho, that they could permit, this was allowing permits for 1 year or less, they could permit them for more years by saying it's a minor special use that uses less than 5 contiguous acres of land, meaning the apiaries, those little boxes that have can have 60,000 bees in each box, don't take more than 5 acres of land, but they go miles to do the gathering of pollen. So that really should not be applying. And then we're requesting that a policy directive be given to all the national forests that any apiary permit requests need to be accompanied by an environmental impact statement or an environmental assessment. And very similarly, in September 2020, we did a petition to the US Department of Interior and BLM, but they have different regulatory regulations that they do the same thing. This departmental memo explicitly mentions approving the use of BLM lands for apiaries by CE. And this one lays out the baseline criteria for categorical exclusions. And we explain in our petition why apiaries don't meet that. And we ask, we ask for a very similar, essentially the same policy directive. So in the petitions, we give scientific basis with some 47 research studies, thanks to Vince Tepedino and Center for Biological Diversity and Xerces Society, that honeybees displace and outcompete native bees, that permitting apiaries pose disease risks. They impact protected species, including endangered pollinators and native plants, all of which has been explained earlier in this panel, and that pollinators are declining globally. Then the same petition goes on to name two legal bases. One, that categorical exclusions may not be applied because they cannot, apiaries placements, the Forest Service or the BLM cannot be certain to have no significant effects. Because of what Wayne Padgett was mentioning, there's very little known about where certain native bees are, what their relation is to potentially rare plant, that the Forest Service or BLM aren't able to make a showing that permitting an apiary with millions of bees will not have any significant effects. And then extraordinary circumstances, both agencies and under NEPA indicate that you need to be certain you can do even activities under categorical exclusions unless extraordinary circumstances exist. Well, an extraordinary circumstance could include the existence of critical habitat for a particular plant that's pollinated by insects, or that there is Suckley's cuckoo bee potentially in the area, it's habitat for it, or western bumblebee. So that the likelihood of extraordinary circumstances, given the global decline of pollinators and the decline of rare native plants, those will likely exist in an area that is covered by where honeybees gather their pollen. So ultimately, the goal of both of these petitions is to require an environmental assessment for each apiary permit request, because each apiary permit request is in a different location in the United States on federal lands, with different sensitive plant species and different pollinators in trouble. So if the agency had to do an environmental assessment, they would have to answer the question, is there any potential for significant impacts? Are there alternatives to use of the public lands? And this is one thing Xerces Society works on, as Scott mentioned, in terms of crop reserve lands that are on private lands, which would be an alternative nectar source for honeybees. And These EAs or EISs allow for the public and scientists to contribute to, as Tara said, allow CBD to, quote, help the agency with information for their environmental assessment. In sum, it can't be just a permit. It can't be just a petition. The phrase, it takes a village to raise a child, it takes a village to protect native bees. And for instance, Vince Tepedino, who's been mentioned several times tonight, has for decades done native bee field research, which is very time consuming, labor intensive, and requires special plant and native bee identification. And he has sounded the alarm regarding apiaries on public lands among bee experts and scientists. The Xerces Society does all kinds of things, describes and promotes alternatives on private lands, promotes alternatives to the neonicotinoid and other bee killing pesticides, which sometimes drives some beekeepers to want to go to the public lands where those pesticides aren't being used. In the 2018 Farm Bill was successful in adding conservation reserve program acres, which are private land acres where honeybees could go. If that's what the CRP landowner grew, plants that are attractive to honeybees. Provides training on the apiary issue for Forest Service, BLM, and state agency staff, and has done this same kind of issue of trying to force state wildlands to look at the impacts of honeybees. Utah Native Plant Society advocates for native bee pollination of native plants and does the equally time-consuming and labor-intensive and specialist attention to tracking rare native plants on ground. Where are they? Where were they? Are they declining? And Project 1100, this new organization, which will soon have a website, is tracking all apiary permitting on the Colorado Plateau, maps sensitive native bee and plants, lists on BLM field offices and Forest Service ranger districts, so that when we see that an apiary by Freedom of Information Act, we learn where apiary permits are coming up to be due, we can tell the BLM field office manager, you know, you've got these 3 sensitive or rare or even listed plants on your district that would be at risk, or you have habitat for Western Bumblebee, because they often don't know this connection between honeybees and native bees and native plants. We communicate directly with the Forest Service and BLM throughout the Colorado Plateau, and they're usually very receptive and interested. They had no idea of this, the nature of this threat of honeybee apiaries. We're including apiary concerns in forest management plans, and we're notifying bee specialists and organizations of this effort. And then Center for Biological Diversity, as Tara noted, undertakes listing petitions and litigation on behalf of rare native bees and plants, and of course, all kinds of other animals. And then there's all these bee biologists, pollination ecologists, and botanists that provide the necessary field evidence for the kind of maps that Tara was showing as to where, for instance, Suckley's cuckoo bee used to be, and these people that go out on the land, and some of them are self-taught, some of them are formally trained, but there's amazing people who provide precise evidence to create those maps. So it's a very complex network of organizations and folks that have to help each other. And special thanks, Claire Moni, for helping us bring this presentation. She's a first-year law student at the University of Oregon and is doing some 8 presentations, overseeing some 8 presentations during their Public Interest Environmental Law Conference. And of course, thanks to the law students that are organizing the entire Public Interest Environmental Law Conference. So perhaps there are some questions that people have written in chat or could write right now. And I think that's going to be shared with us so that any one of us can answer the questions. Right, Claire?
Yes, thank you so much, everybody, for your presentations. So yeah, now we'll move on to the Q&A session. So please drop any questions on the YouTube chat if anybody has one. But we'll start with a question that came in from somebody on our Zoom call first. Who asked, why did they want to put honeybees on public lands in the first place? So what was the motivation behind putting honeybees on public lands?
Scott, do you want to
Sure.
speak to that?
Sure. Yeah, I think that there are several motivations, but the issue of honeybees on public lands has shifted. So in the 1980s, when Dinah Baer was looking at this, there were 2 reasons. We didn't know the implications, but there also wasn't as large of a commercial honeybee industry out there. And at that time, it was simply the guy with 10 hives in the back of his truck making honey to maybe sell at the farmer's market, right? It was like there was a problem, but the scope of the problem has gotten so much larger. So over time, so there was that. It's like, you take them up, there's lots of flowers, you can get really cool honey, you can sell it at the farmer's market. But what's really happened in the late 1990s through now is the advent of lots of new insecticides that kill bees, that kill all bees, not just honeybees, but kill honeybees as well as all of the native bees. And people talk about neonicotinoids, but beyond neonicotinoids, we have all sorts of highly toxic, systemic, long-lived, highly mobile insecticides in the environment. And because these insecticides move, you apply them on the crops and they move into edges of crops. They move into across the landscape, that anywhere close to ag or even urban areas, there are really not pesticide-free habitat. And just quickly, we did a study in California looking at milkweed across an environmental gradient, and we found no milkweed plants that did not have at least some insecticide residue in them. Wildlife refuges, organic farms, roadsides, of course, the highest concentrations, multiple insecticides were in commercial agriculture, as well as some urban areas. So that's the reason. You can take your bees and put them in Utah, in the middle of Utah, and they are protected from insecticides. But the other reason is really because we have started industrial beekeeping. We move bees across the country to pollinate almonds, to pollinate apples in Washington, to pollinate other crops. And in doing so, these animals are highly stressed. They often don't have enough nutrition. So they're really looking for kind of that respite. It's like the spa for honeybees, right? Hey, let's put them off over here. They don't have any of the issues. They've got a lot of forage. They don't have any pesticides. They can sort of bulk up. They can, if they're sickly because they haven't had good nutrition and they've been hit by pesticides. So the issue has gotten a lot bigger because as I said, it used to be, hey, 10 hives, 20 hives. Now it's 4,000 hives, it's 900 hives, it's, it's the scale and scope is bigger, but it is driven by lack of habitat and lack of pesticide-free habitat. But it's complicated, and that's why I wanted to explain it.
Well, there's also a cost associated with, the cost of putting bees on national forest and BLM land is very low. And so it's a safe and, cheap place to store their bees while they're not pollinating crops, while they're not in the almond field, orchards or whatever. So there is a cost aspect around involved as well. And a lot of these areas they're putting them on forests have high diversity of native plants, and the beekeepers love them. There's a pollen, there's a product that comes off the public lands that's really highly valued too. And as again, I said, it's very low cost.
Yeah, good point.
And it may not be clear to everybody, but the beekeepers make their money being paid to pollinate the almond trees or the apples or the other commercial crops. And it's in the off season when they're taking a rest from that they want to go on public lands. And most beekeepers do not use the public lands. So it's very similar to livestock grazing. Most livestock owners do not use public lands, but those that do are spread out through all the lands. And in the case of beekeepers, all it takes, one beekeeper called AD Honey, ADEE Honey, requested the 9,000 hives that Wayne mentioned on the 4 national forests in Utah. One beekeeper, 9,000 hives. That's millions and millions and millions of honeybees. So it's a case of if we can get a hold of this through this petition and going to the Biden administration in light of climate change effects on pollinators and native plants, and get this requirement that the Forest Service or BLM would have to do an assessment and face the reality of what they are doing when they permit apiaries, we could handle this particular problem. And of course, as Scott points out, there's lots of other problems both the honeybees and the native bees face. But this is a doable, this project to end the permitting on public lands is doable.
Great, thank you so much. We have a few questions coming in on YouTube. So do any of the managed bees crossbreed with native bees, resulting in inferior hybrid pollinators?
No, they're quite different, right? They're not even from this country, and so it is really limited to the disease and competition that we see. We don't see that. It's not like salmon or something like that, where we've got farm salmon that might outcross with our native salmon, because they're totally different species.
Great, thank you. Can anything be done with apiaries on either a small inholding or adjacent state wildlife areas where the bees forage for several miles on public lands?
I don't quite understand exactly the question, but
I think the question, and perhaps, I don't know if you can unmute the person that asked the question. I think the question is, well, if they're on adjacent lands, isn't that still a problem of going on to the public lands? And can anything be done about that? Not regulatory wise. However, it's interesting in Grand County, Utah, which is the county in which Moab and Castle Valley, where I live, is a county where the county beekeeper, the county bee inspector, excuse me, does not want honeybees on public lands and has gotten an ordinance passed gotten a county ordinance passed by the county commission that says no migratory beekeepers can stay overnight south of I-70 in Grand County. He doesn't want 80 Honey or one of these other commercial operations parking for the night on their way somewhere else, and their bees getting loose or leaving the hives and getting established on the public lands. Now, he has no control over migratory beekeepers being given a permit on federal lands. He has no control over that. But as far as he's trying to deal with this question that I think someone was asking, he doesn't want big numbers of honeybees anywhere near the public lands.
But I do want to say that there is a difference between honeybee hives adjacent to public lands and in the heart of public lands. It is a problem, and they do go on to public lands, but driving these bees, 9,000 hives throughout the public lands really is problematic because you're taking up so much of the forage of the native species. You would never be able to do that on the periphery likely of this. And the other issue that I do want to point out is there's infrastructure involved. This is not pickup trucks. These are semis moving hives up into an area where they stage them, basically just becomes denuded, right? Because of the trucks and the equipment, you have to have forklifts to lift everything. So you've got this footprint, and then the bees radiate out from there. And the other thing that I haven't mentioned, but there is some evidence too that this can impact black bears, because at least in the east, where we have had apiaries in the northeastern United States, black bears are attracted to honey, right? And then these black bears become problem bears, and then these black bears have to be killed because they become problem bears at these apiaries. So I don't know the impact potentially in Utah or other places, but there are other wildlife impacts from the footprint as well as potentially from attracting other wildlife to these apiaries.
And they have been permitted on 15 states within the United States on national forest lands,
Yeah.
from the East Forest in Vermont to California. So they're widespread.
Great, thank you. We also have a couple more questions coming in from the Zoom call. So why is it thought there will be a better outcome now for banning pesticides? And also, is there anything an average person can do to help?
So Tara, do you want to answer?
Tara?
Oh,
I think that question came in, I think, Scott, when you were giving your sort of historical overview of why beekeepers want to be, and you kind of, I think you hit on that really well, and that, banning pesticides would, especially neonicotinoids and also their friends, as I like to say, very similar systemic pesticides that, like you said, kill bees outright. And getting documents about the 80 honey request for 9,000 hives, one of the documents was very clear that one of the major reasons they were looking to put their hives on the land in Utah was because of pesticides and poisoning of where they used to put their bees. And so, it's kind of that sort of background pushing reason that Scott described, and that would be why there would be a better outcome when banning certain really bee toxic pesticides.
And we'll have new administration at EPA that's getting put in place as we speak. But then, you can't count on someone at the EPA necessarily knowing about this issue. It's
Right.
not, that's why the education efforts of Xerces Society and Utah Native Plant Society and Project 1100 and so on are so important, because we will try to convey this information as simply and directly as we can to incoming. I've already been finding out the names of a couple of folks at Council Environmental Quality that I'll eventually want to talk to. And CBD and Xerces have national reputations for talking with Biden administration key decision makers at the EPA, correct?
Yeah.
Scott?
Yeah,
Certain.
definitely.
Certainly. And I do want to address, they asked what they could do. We can all do something to help pollinators. Plant native plants, plants that are native to your area. Make sure though, when you go to the nursery to buy those plants, you ask what pesticides were used on them. Because our big box nurseries especially, but even some of the more local nurseries that might source from large growers can have neonicotinoids and other problem pesticides actually in the plants you buy. So lots of native plants in your yard. Leave some messiness and maybe some bare ground. Native bees nest in old snags or in bare ground, and then don't use insecticides. One thing, we often point to farmers in their use of pesticides, but USGS routinely finds that more pesticides are used in urban and suburban areas on a pound per acre basis than in ag areas. And we use a lot of pesticides for the quest for the perfect lawn and the perfect rows. So do those three things and then tell your neighbor why, right? And get your community involved. We also have lots of communities that are banning problem pesticides or all pesticides on their parklands and other lands. There's a lot that we can do at the local, county, state level. We're going to be pushing EPA on pesticides, and I know Center for Biological Diversity is a massive force to be reckoned with, as well as some of these other bigger conservation groups, in litigation and other things. But pesticides are a difficult issue. That's a long-term struggle, even under friendly administrations. We worked under the Obama administration and did not get nearly as far as we should have on pesticides. But pesticides are tied to climate change. This administration seems at least talking a lot about climate change. So let's hope that they see all of these connections with pesticides. And then Mary's right. This honeybee issue really can fly under the radar. And this is an issue that there has to be a lot of public education out there so that people understand the problem. Because I talk to lawmakers all the time, who are like, bees, oh yeah, honeybees, we need to protect the honeybee, right? That's immediately what they gravitate to. So we've got a lot of work to do to make sure that people know there's 3,600 other species of animals out there that are called bees, and that we shouldn't pit them against each other.
Another thing, and with my kind of laser focus on public lands, simply some of us know our local district ranger or someone in the local BLM field office, and just saying, do you permit apiaries on your land? And if they say no, that's a big chance, because most of them don't have it, to say, good for you. And I hope you never do, because that's a huge threat to native bees. And I just was out with my most local district ranger a couple months ago, and he literally had never heard of this issue. He did not know there were native bees. He didn't know that honeybees were exotic. And sometimes I say to people, when somehow native bees comes up or Project 1100, I'll say, how many bee species do you think there are in Utah? And they'll say 40. And I'll say, no, 1,100. And it's jaw-dropping to people. So just the conveying of information that honeybees are not native, and there's a zillion native bees that need protection. Just in Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument alone, there's 660 bee species.
Yeah.
In the entire East Coast, east of Mississippi, the entire United States, east of the Mississippi River, there's 770 species, 760 species. And just in the little spot of Grand Staircase, there's 660. So just conveying information anytime. I mean, Wayne Paget is up among a national forest that has the most apiaries in the state of Utah, and can be putting pressure on them.
Retired now, of course. But
That's right.
but you're right. I think, Mary, that the point is, that I mean, I've talked with you about this. A lot of forests and a lot of Bureau of Land Management offices, they're poorly staffed in relationship to this issue. I mean, they don't have people on their staffs that even know or aware that it's a problem. And so I think it's really, really important that you do contact your local district, Forest Service district, supervisor's office, the regional office, whatever level, and the Bureau of Land Management, the field offices, the district offices, and talk to the people and help to educate the people that are working there. And also every state has a native plant society. They're usually very active in this issue, I think, seeing they're getting more so all the time. California, Oregon, I know that your native plant societies are very active, and they're usually got a lot of very, very important people as far as relationship to the problem. So, and getting the word out and helping us move forward. So, yeah.
Awesome, thank you. I know we're kind of short on time, but there are a few more questions if you guys don't mind staying on to answer.
Sure.
Have you used any citizen science projects to help with the task of monitoring the native bees and plants?
Well, I'll go first. We call them community science projects these days. I just want to point out, unfortunately, over the last 4 years, the term citizen has become loaded. So
Yeah.
many conservation groups have moved to the term community science, organizing your community to get scientific data. And we have a program called Bumblebee Watch, which allows people to go out, photograph bumblebees, upload them to our website, try to identify them, and then our expert reviewers will codify, will tell you whether you identified them correctly or not so. There's also iNaturalist. So when you're out there, iNaturalist is an incredible platform for any bee that's out there that you can upload photos to. And there's a lot of experts looking at those. So there is no universal native bee community science project yet, because they're so diverse and it's difficult for the public to really identify a lot of them. And that's why we worked with folks from Canada and now folks from Mexico on Bumblebee Watch, because it's a more manageable fauna. But what we found is, one, we're getting incredible data that's really useful in conservation of bumblebees, but these people become advocates for conservation of bees. And often some of them start to branch out and start IDing other groups as well. Those are our Uber volunteers.
It's interesting. Just today, I was on email with our local BLM field office, who has gotten the go-ahead from Fish and Wildlife Service for our Canyonlands chapter of Utah Native Plant Society to do surveys on Jones cyclodenia, which is a plant that may soon be listed, and they need to know how it's doing at the sites, and that there's a Moab area cluster of cyclodenia that several of us here in Castle Valley and Moab will be monitoring. It's doable because it's a rare plant, We have sites where it has been in the past. We have citizens, members of the community who can go out to that plant, and then we're going to add the observations of whether any pollinators are seen on it and any seed set.
That's great. And one thing to point out, Mary, that people should be looking at this. So about a decade ago now, I hope things have changed, but a conservation plan came out for rare plants in Oregon and Washington. And it was a draft conservation assessment, and they had based the distance for where they needed clusters of these 4 native rare plants on honeybee pollination. And we knew that none of them were ever touched by honeybees, right? We wrote comments going, wait, one's a fly pollinated, one's a moth pollinated, one's a butterfly pollinated, one's a little tiny native bee pollinated, right? And so we do need to be looking at that. I hope that's changing, but it is really interesting when you could go really awry by basing pollination of rare plants on what honeybees might do. They fly farther. There's more of them. I don't know. It was just so ludicrous when we got the conservation plan. We were like, wait, what? And it wasn't that hard to go to those native plants and figure out what was pollinating them, as long as you just needed to go, right? And look. And so that's great you're doing that.
Okay, next question is, why do only a few beekeepers want to use the public lands, and are they going to protest this action?
That's a good question. A lot of honeybee keepers go to particular private lands. They know the owner, they have the relationship with them. Some of them have their own fields. Some can use the crop reserve program lands. So I have a sheet on alternatives to public lands that actually one of the listeners here, Thomas Mines, and another listener, Ellie Stevenson, worked on for Project 1100. And Xerces is working on alternatives. So they actually, our current sheet is in front of Scott to see if he wants to add anything to it, but we do have a whole list of alternatives. So but it was interesting when Ellie Stevenson, who's a listener here, talked with a couple of industry folks, industry association folks, beekeepers. It sounded like they weren't really terribly active at advocating for getting crop reserve program lands and private lands. And Scott may have a different impression, but they aren't, the bee industry associations are not being terribly active at finding their own lands to use. Would you agree, Scott?
I would agree. I mean, I think there are some exceptions, but I think they need to do more for themselves. And I think really the take-home message too is that if you are an almond producer in California, you have a responsibility to provide habitat for these animals that you're bringing in. I mean, it should not be that we're using a public good to benefit, a large agricultural commodity. And that is what I think that the Honeybee Keepers Association and the other associations, as well as the large agricultural sectors, the Farm Bureau and others, they kind of just push this off to a different place, and they are not taking as much action as they can. We do know of one almond grower, though, who has taken it upon themselves, a pretty large almond grower, to just start beekeeping. They keep their own bees. They don't have to rent them anymore. They're providing decent forage for them. And then they have these bees to pollinate their almonds. And, you know, that's another potential for some of these ag sectors. The other thing we should know is that a lot of times we bring in honeybees, even though they're not needed. Native bees are amazing at pollinating many of our crop plants. The issue is that the giant monocultures and use of insecticides precludes them from getting to those crop plants, right? And where you have smaller farms where you're using organic or sustainable methods or ecological pest management, some of these places are moving away from using honeybees. And we found in certain areas that the native bees can do all of the pollination of certain crops that are out there. So there are many, many solutions, but this is also tied to industrial agriculture. As I mentioned in my talk, no one used honeybees to pollinate crops until crop sizes got really large monocultures, and we started using in that case, broad spectrum insecticides, the carbamates and organophosphates, that killed everything from frogs to humans. And that's when we started having to move honeybees around. And that's when this industry of giant semis really arose from. And it's part of this ag system. And we have to take back that agricultural system. And what one person mentioned, what can anybody do? The other thing you can do is use your pocketbook. Buy sustainable or organic food, food that we're not dousing with insecticides. And the more of us can do that, the more we're driving a system that will be less hostile to our native pollinators. And I will just give a plug. Xerces has their own third-party certified, the only third-party certified bee label for food. It's called Bee Better Certified. And so farmers have to do a lot to get that certification. But if you see that bee and the Bee Better Certified seal, it means that these farmers are doing it the right way.
Claire, I think what part of that question too was is there going to be any pushback from the growers? And I think according to that article I read by Jennifer Oldham, the Yale Environment 360 article, I think there is going to be some pushback. I mean, they've got a good thing going on, and they know it. They know the value of what the resource is out to them. So I do think there's going to be pushback. I don't think they'll go away quietly. So
one of the pushers is actually Cox Honey of Utah, very, very vocal at trying to push Congress to require that federal land managers allow commercial honeybee apiaries. So yes, thanks Wayne for catching that other part of that person's question.
And we heard from a Forest Service person that a senator had called his boss and said, you need to figure out how to get honeybees on Forest Service land. Senator from Utah. So
that happens. Yes, that happens.
Yeah.
It's who's
so they are pushing back. So I'm glad you caught that, Wayne. I don't think it's going to be a one-way educating.
No. And it's a very vocal group. So yeah.
Probably we're running out of time, right, Claire? Was there any one last question?
We have two more. I think one of them will be quick. How much do commercial apiaries pay to park their hives on private lands?
Probably it varies. I'm guessing that it's everything from someone who wants their crop pollinated and it's a mutual agreement to, I don't know what CRP land managers charge honeybee keepers. Do you know, Scott?
Yeah, so a lot of times it's free, right?
Right.
Oftentimes, many of our migratory beekeepers are up in the upper Midwest in North Dakota and Minnesota. And it's sort of just they know the people with CRP and they'll be able to put their hives on CRP. On the other side, though, these beekeepers are paid to pollinate, right? So they're making money by placing their hives in almond orchards or apple orchards. So I think it totally varies because of this. These are private lands and they could charge, but I think a lot of times I think it's, give us a bunch of honey and you can put your bees out here, right? And you're farmers, we're farmers, let's all work together. And that's okay, especially if we're really able to keep these hives on our working lands, our agricultural lands. So I don't think there's any set price. And Wayne or Mary, is there a set price like there is for a cow-calf pair on public land, or is that across the board different?
I believe it's a set price
I think so. I think
and
it
it's
is.
low.
It's
It's
low.
very low. Yeah, and I remember reading what the number was last week, but I couldn't tell you right now.
Yeah, it was $50 or something. It was
I
very,
think it's
very
that
low.
much, yeah.
It's
Well, yeah, it's
nothing.
per hive or something. It's a low price per hive, like a couple dollars per hive or something like that.
Okay, that makes sense.
But I can't remember what the number was.
It's a good question.
Yeah.
Thank you. And one last question. Are the varroa mites one of the contaminants from honey to native bees? I don't know
No,
if I'm saying that right.
they are not actually. Varroa mites are, although I believe they've found them in. I'm going to take that back. I'm not 100% sure, and when I'm not 100% sure, I like to say that. But what I know is that they've never been identified as a major problem that can skip from honeybees to native bees. Because honeybees, the size of the hive and the size of the bees, I think really allow varroa mite to thrive in certain hives. But I'm going to preface that by saying in the literature, it's never come up as a major problem, but I don't know for 100% fact.
That's a scientist speaking.
I was
If
gonna
you
say
don't
the
know,
same
say you
thing.
don't know. Sorry, Kim.
Yeah, I was just gonna say the same thing. Yeah, I haven't seen it either. I don't think so, but I think they can go between different species of honeybees, but not between native bees. I haven't seen that, but I also don't know 100%.
And if it was really a scientific response, it would be more research is needed and we welcome the funding. I'll mute myself.
Yes. Well, in the conservation response is more conservation is needed and funding is welcome. So that works.
And just so you know, Thomas, you might unmute yourself. Thomas was a fellow, a pollinator fellow with me when I was with Grand Canyon Trust. And he's now entered a master's program at Montana State University in pollination biology. And you're, in a couple of sentences, your research is what, Thomas?
I'm looking at how to benefit monarch butterfly and bee conservation in Idaho in right-of-way zones. So I'm working with the Department of Transportation there. So thank you, Mary. And thank you all for a really great presentation. I worked on this topic a lot when we were first kind of starting it, and it's great to see you all continue the work.
Yeah, good to hear about you, Thomas. Thanks for your work.
Absolutely.
Okay, should we sign off now, Claire?
Yeah, I think that's all the questions we have. Thank you all so much for presenting, and thanks everybody for tuning in and for all the great questions that came in. Just one more plug for the FLAW donations and CLE credits. That link is at the top of the chat. So thanks everyone again, and I'll end the live stream now.
Claire, will you send a link to the YouTube so that I can send that out, and other people, I'll get it to all of us. Okay?
Yes, I will. Thank you.